Hello and welcome to the GameDev Outpost. In this video, we'll be talking about an introduction to Niagara in Unreal Engine 4, specifically Unreal Engine 4.25. In 4.25 and above, Niagara is production ready, although it still does have bugs. So by default, it's already enabled. If you right-click in the content browser and you go to Effects, you can see that all of your Niagara options are here. If you're using below 4.25, you want to go to Edit, Plugins, and you want to go down to Effects. And then you want to enable the Niagara plugin and the Niagara extras. After you enable that, you'll want to restart the engine. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and I'm going to make a new folder for effects. And then I'm going to give this a color so I can see it easier. And in this folder, I'm going to right click, we're going to go to effects, and we want to make a Niagara emitter. From here you'll have a few options. You can make a new emitter from a template, you can inherit from one that's already made, you can also copy one that's already made. We're just going to make a new emitter from a template. So we'll click next, and then we want to click on empty, and then we'll click on finish. From here we'll give it a name. And for good naming conventions, we'll just name it NE, and then whatever you want. And then we'll double click on it to open it up. Now when you open this up for the first time, there's a few things that we don't want to look at because they're distracting and we're not ready to talk about those yet. So we want to close the parameters window and we want to close the scratch pad. Now overall, if you've been using Unreal for a while, the interface is not too different. You can slide all of these windows and adjust them. You have a menu bar, you have a toolbar, preview window, you have a workspace window, and then you have a timeline down here. In the system overview, we have a few hotkeys and mouse controls that we can use. If you right click, you can move the system overview window. If you left click, you can drag and select. If you middle mouse wheel, you can zoom in and out. And then if you hit F, or if you hit A on the keyboard, it'll recenter and focus. If you hit C on the keyboard, you'll get a comment window. You can select it and you can hit delete on the keyboard. You can also select the emitter itself and hit C for comment. Now the Niagara emitter itself has two types of things in here. We have categories, which are the emitter settings, emitter spawn, emitter update, particle spawn, particle update, add event handler, and render. All of the things underneath of these are called modules. So when you select your emitter, you'll see that in the selection window, everything shows up. Every option that you have currently in your emitter. The categories and the modules. You can also select the categories one by one, and then I'll show the category and the property. You can also just select the module itself to see what's just in there. Additionally, if you want to see two modules at the same time, you can multi-select, and you can see those in the selection window. Now the first category to look at, and the first module we'll look at, is the emitter settings and the emitter properties. In a later video, we'll talk about scalability, but this is where you can set up platform-specific stuff, or LOD kind of stuff. In the emitter section, this is where we can choose between CPU and GPU. You can choose whether or not the emitter is going to be local or if it's going to be world. If you end up wanting particles to trail, this is where you'll turn on local space. And then we have fixed bounds. Now there's a multitude of reasons why you would have fixed bounds on. If this is a GPU particle, you need to have fixed bounds turned on. It has to be on. With that said, in your toolbar, you can turn on the bounds so you can visualize where your particles are. If you're trying to move around the preview window, sometimes you get lost and you can't find your particle. It makes it a little easier to find where your particles are. And we will come back to the emitter, but I want to talk about the preview window for a second. The first thing to point out are the preview window settings. So if you go up to the menu bar and you click on window, you'll see preview scene settings. Click on that and you'll open up a window. If you toggle show environment, this will turn your environment on and off. Sometimes you want the environment on, sometimes you want it off. Other notable settings in here are under show. You can turn the grid on and off. You can also turn on particle count. Although this is kind of redundant. You can see that the particle count here is 0. And then also over on the selection window, you can see that the particle count is 0 here as well. To navigate the preview window, you use right mouse button to zoom in and out. You use left mouse button to orbit. And you use middle mouse button to pan. You can also wheel in and out to zoom. So coming back to the emitter, you can see that nothing is spawning right now. So our first goal should be to spawn something. So we're going to look at render first. Under render, if you click on the plus icon, we can render meshes, we can render ribbons, we can render sprites. Right now by default, we have a sprite renderer, and we can see that there's a material associated with it. Some other properties in here are alignment and facing mode. This has to do with billboarding. We have sorting modes, so how will the particles sort between each other? And then we have sub UV. This is meant for flipbooks, and we'll come back to this in a future tutorial. So we are choosing to render something here, so the renderer is not our issue. Next, we want to come up to emitter spawn and emitter update. So technically, you shouldn't really have to add anything to emitter spawn, because currently we have an emitter. But if we click on this plus icon, you notice that we do get quite a few options in here. And particularly, we get options for spawning. So we're going to click on spawn rate. And once you do that, you'll see that we get an error. In a lot of situations, Niagara's going to try and do its best job in letting you know when something isn't correct. So if you read in here, it'll say reposition this module in the correct order related to emitter state. You can dismiss this, or you can click on fix issue. And what you notice is this just went from emitter spawn to emitter update. So we really don't need to do anything in emitter spawn. We want to do it in emitter update. So once again, we'll click on this, and we're going to hit delete on the keyboard so that we can hit the plus icon on emitter update. When we click that plus icon, you'll see that we have a category for spawning again, and you'll see that spawn rate is in there once again. Now with the spawn rate module, this is saying how many particles do we want to spawn per second. So we can set this to a whole number, or we can also set this to a decimal number, something like 0.5 or something like 3.25. So if I put in 1, this is going to spawn 1 particle per second. Now if we turn this off and we add a different module and we go to spawning, we can choose spawn burst instantaneous. Now this module is saying how many particles do we want to spawn and when do we want to spawn them. Turn that off and we'll turn on spawn rate. So now you can see that we have something rendering, but the simulation isn't playing right now. So if you want to play the simulation, you want to come up to the toolbar and you want to hit play, or you can come down to the timeline, and down here you have a play button as well. And turn off bounds. Now each one of these spawns are dependent on the emitter state. And the main properties in here have to do with the loop behavior. Under this lifecycle mode, if you click on this dropdown, if you have it set to system by default, for now just change it to self. Under the loop behavior, you can choose if you want it to loop forever, or if you want it to loop once. And if you choose once, you can choose fixed, or you can also say once forever. You can also choose multiple, and in here you can set how many times you want it to loop and how long the loop duration is. So you can see that this loop duration is set to 1 second. So after 1 second, it's going to loop again. You can increase this. You can see that it adjusts on the timeline. If you come down to the timeline, if you hover right over the edge here, you can grab this end and you can start to pull it in either direction. And when you do that, it's going to update that loop duration. There's 2 different ways you can change the loop duration. For right now, I'll set it back to infinite, or I'll set it back to once. Now let's look at particle spawn and particle update. So the way that I look at particle spawn is, what are the particles doing from the start? These are things that can happen when the particles are spawned. Versus the particle update, these are, what do you want to change about the particles? These are things that can happen after particles are spawned. So under particle spawn, we do have plus options. You can add many different things in here. But let's take a look at the initialized particle. So in initialized particle, we have color, we have mass, and we have lifetime. Now this is important to talk about, the lifetime. The lifetime in the particle is different than the emitter lifetime. This is how long the emitter lives, and this is how long a particle lives. Particles can and often will live longer than the emitter. In particle update, we have particle state, which directly relates to the initialized particle. This says, kill particles when lifetime has elapsed. So that directly relates to the lifetime. So in particle spawn, if we add velocity in here and say we wanted to add velocity on the X, in this situation, the particles are being spawned with a velocity already. So they're going. But we can also add another velocity so that we can change it after they're spawned. And what we'll see in the particle update is if we add this, we're going to get an issue because the velocity needs to be in the correct order. So we can grab this and we can just move this above solve forces and velocity. So now if we change this to something like 10, now we're updating the particle even though it's been initialized with a velocity. Alright, so the last thing to go over in the emitter is the timeline. It's important to note that in the timeline, you can right click and add a folder, but it's pointless. There's no reason to do that in the emitter at all. You can also click on track and you do add folder. There's no reason to do that. You can only ever have this one bar right here. Down here, these are our play settings. So we can pause or play. We can reverse, play or pause, etc. We can scrub on our timeline, so we can play through the particle system. We can right click and move left and right, so we have a better view. If you hold down Control and middle mouse wheel, you can zoom in and out on the time. You can also set the start time and the end time. This is just for previewing. If you scrub to a certain point, let's say 0, you can right click and you can set the start time. And just the same, you can right click anywhere and you can set the end time. Alright, let's save our emitter and we'll close out. And we're going to go and drag this into the world. But what you'll see is you can't bring an emitter into the world. It doesn't work that way. You can't just bring it in. So you're going to need a Niagara System. And there's a few ways to do that. You can right click and you can go to Create Niagara System, or you can right click in the content browser, go to Effects, and you can click on Niagara System. Now from here it'll be kind of similar to the Niagara emitter, where it'll ask you if you want to make something from the selected emitter. You can select the emitter and make this work. Maybe you want to use a template, or maybe you want to copy an existing system. We're just going to create an empty system. And click Finish. Name this NS for good naming conventions, and then whatever you want. And then we'll open that up. And you'll see that this looks very similar. The only difference is that you have this thing right here. But we're not going to talk about that right now. There's a few different ways that you can get your emitter into this system. In your content browser, if you just grab your emitter and just drag and drop it right into the timeline, it'll be in here. If it doesn't start playing right away, it's either compiling or it's a little buggy. So try closing the system and then reopening it. Other ways that you can add your system is by right-clicking and going to Add Emitter, and then you want to find your emitter. You can also go to the track field, and under here you'll see emitter, and you can find your emitter under there as well. You can't duplicate your emitter, but you can copy it and you can paste it. So now you have two. You can see that they space out next to each other. In the system overview, you can also copy it here and you can paste it. Now, there's a few things to note about the Niagara system. Even though you have an emitter in here, you're inheriting. So if you try and select one of these modules and you hit delete, you're going to get yelled at. It's going to say this module cannot be deleted because it's inherited. What you can do though is you can turn these modules on and off. Or you can also override settings. So maybe you don't want 10, maybe you want 20. When you override a setting, you'll get a green revert icon, letting you know that you can revert this back to the parent emitter. Alright, we'll hit save, we'll close out of this, and then we'll drag our system in. And what you'll see is it starts playing right away. Pull this up. And if you have a problem, and if you're having a problem seeing any of this in your environment, just hit G on the keyboard and remove the engine UI. If this isn't playing right away, you can click on Force Solo and it'll play. Or of course you can go and play and simulate. If you want to learn about some of the other modules and how they work, I recommend just going and taking a look at the other emitter templates. Just check them out and then look at the modules and turn them on and off, just to see what they do. Try and break it. Alright guys, this covers an introduction to Niagara and Unreal Engine 4. If you thought this video was useful and it helped, please let me know by commenting down below and liking the video. Thanks guys.